Oh, yes, and good evening to you. Good evening to some of you. Good night to some of you. Good afternoon to some of you. It's Monday. It's Monday, the first day of the traditional work week, as we say, the civil servants week. It's Monday. Welcome to Politics 101. Please do as we are called upon to do. Share the link. Some of you have already started to do that. Please share the link and let everyone know that we are on tonight, Politics 101, 7 o'clock Guyana time, Monday through Friday. And it's the place to be. We, of course, start the ball rolling for the afternoon, for the evening. Sherrod Duncan follows at 8 o'clock, and then Mark Benchop at 9 o'clock. Of course, in the mornings, we have the Guyanese morning time with Brother Kidaki Amsterdam. And in between that, we have a number of other programs. Norman Brown, I keep forgetting Brother Norman Brown, who does the voice of the diaspora. Rickford Burke, of course, does. I think he does on Thursday nights, Sunday nights. But of course, we have Paul Slow with his program on Wednesdays. I think he does twice per week now. So we have quite a lineup of programs throughout the week. But on weekday evenings, we are here at 7 o'clock rolling, starting the ball rolling, and followed by Sherrod at 8 o'clock and Mark at 9 o'clock. Welcome to all of you to Politics 101. Wow. I suppose we have settled in to 2024. We are now gone past 3 weeks in the year, and it seems as though Christmas and New Year's and all that stuff was a long, long time ago. Time waits on no woman or man. Welcome to Politics 101, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from in Guyana or outside of Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. We have not heard for a little bit anything about the Argyle Declaration. All of a sudden, Venezuela has gone off the radar. And this is one of the problems that we face with a regime, a government in office that doesn't have a coherent outlook on the world, doesn't have a coherent set of values and ideas to which it subscribes. And even when it has some values to which it subscribes, they have negative impacts on our country. Welcome to Politics 101, Monday evening. Trust you all had a productive weekend. These days, the weekends are working weekends for a lot of us. The world has changed in many ways. And even those of us who do the traditional week, Monday through Friday, there's so much to do on the weekends that it feels as though you are still at work. Those of you who join us from down south, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, in many regards, very much south, or welcome to Politics 101. We didn't mention in the program here the passing of Claire Gorin, a fixture in the Guyanese community in New York. She passed away, and I think she was buried today. I peeped in for a little bit on Saturday night on the Tribute store. Quite a fixture in our community, a literary person. She was very much into the arts, into the culture. The Guyana Cultural Organization which she spearheaded, the folk festival and the conference that goes along with it. And she and her team there in New York worked over the years to make that a reality. Rest in peace, Sister Claire. I think they had time in New York to say goodbye to her. Death is always very difficult to deal with, especially someone close to you or someone in the public eye. It's always difficult, but I got the sense that her colleagues had a chance to say goodbye before she transitioned to be with the ancestors. Rest in peace, Claire Gorin, and you have made your contribution. You've made your contribution to our country. Although you left its shores, you continue to fly that flag. And the idea of what Guyana should be and could be, you continue to work for it. Rest in peace, Clay Gorin. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to all of you and welcome. The budget debates started today. I have not had a chance to look at any of the presentations. I'm not a big fan of parliamentary debates, and you all know why, because I suppose is the reason why so many of you are not fans. There is hardly any debate that goes on there. And in any case, why should it be a debate? You know, it should not be a debate. It should be a discussion. It should be an examination of the budget. And it should be a time when the government side should be prepared to listen to criticisms from the opposition side and to insert some of the suggestions of the opposition into the budget. That is what the budget discussion, budget examination, budget analysis should be about. So to begin with, a debate is not what you want for a budget. You're not in a debating club. You want a thorough examination of the budget, especially coming from the opposition side, because it would be the government who would have prepared the budget. And although the government gives the impression of consultation before the preparation of the budget, those to whom or with whom it consulted would often say that their suggestions don't always make it into the budget. I know they met with the Trade Union Congress, they might have met with FITOG, and they obviously would have met with the business associations. But at the end of the day, the government presents its own budget. But there should be a much more structured and inclusive way of preparing a budget. You know, if we had anything to do with the preparation of the budget, you would start long in advance. As soon as this year's budget is passed, you begin to plan for next year's budget. You begin to meet with people's organizations and to get a sense from them what is it they want in the budget. Because after all, the budget is about the people. So the process should be democratized, where people get a chance to make suggestions as to what goes into the budget. And if that were the case, I mean, the Ministry of Finance would become a busy place. They will earn their keep. They will hear from the people what their priorities are, because budgets are about priorities. And sometimes it's difficult to sit in Georgetown in an office and figure out what the priorities of Firish and Port Morant and others are. Sometimes as a political party, you think you know what people are thinking and what people want. And often what they tell you as a political party member is not what they will tell you as a government member. And this is one of the problems with our democratic process. It's party driven. And there's not a distinction between the party and the government. People tell you things if they know you're coming to ask them for their votes. They engage in transaction. You want my vote, this is what you will give me. And then you do your party manifesto. But if you're elected to serve in government, then you have to pivot from the party manifesto to a national manifesto. You have to pivot from the priorities of the party to the priorities of the country, and that includes people who did not vote for you. Clearly, in Guyana, we have a problem with that. It is not easy, one has to admit. It is not easy to make that transition from the priorities of the political party to the priorities of the country as a whole. And that is why the system, the majoritarian system, has its flaws. It works best when the government and the opposition, or it works well when all the parties are speaking to the same constituency. European societies in which that system of majoritarian representative democracy evolve in part, those are for the most part homogeneous societies, homogeneous in terms of race and in some regards ethnicity, homogeneous in terms of culture generally. Generally, Europeans are Europeans, they're white people. And their view of the world tend to coincide. Now, there are differences, there are class differences, ideological differences, yes, there are. But generally, in terms of where they want the society to go, they're generally agreed upon it. Over time, Europe has worked out what kind of society it wants, what kind of political system. The parliamentary system is very old because it was developed in Europe centuries ago. And so they've worked out the political system that worked best for them. And it's a form of representative democracy in which the majority governs. They've worked out their economic system, generally some form of capitalism. It varies across the continent. And culture is not a big deal because they all generally rise out of the European culture. There may be ethnic differences among them, the difference between the French and the German and the British and so on and so forth, the Russians and so on and so forth. But generally they are agreed, they have a certain outlook of the world. And so when the majority wins and the majority governs, for the most part, the majority represent the worldview of the larger society. The majority may differ from the minority ideologically. They may differ in terms of economic emphasis. So even when they agree on capitalism, they may differ whether, unregulated capitalism or regulated capitalism, etc., etc. So it is not that there are not differences in European societies. There are differences, but they generally agree on a certain view of the world, the way the world is going and who should control the world, who should govern. When you come to societies like ours, it's a different thing. We are a society that is quite diverse. But it's more than the diversity. The diversity function more as intractable differences. And it all has to do with the way in which, the manner in which our people came to Guyana, came to the Caribbean. The native Indians, based on the evidence that we have to work with, they're the ones who first migrated into what is now Guyana. Although there is a lot of talk these days that Africans and other Asians and so on may have been here in the so-called Americas before Columbus got here. But the extent to which that was prevalent, research is still being done. So for now, you know, the Europeans are the first one who got here. And then, sorry, the native Indians, the Amerindians. And then the Europeans came. And the Europeans sought to steal the land away from the Amerindians, and a conflictual relationship. And then the Europeans brought Africans against their will to accumulate wealth for Europe. Another conflictual relationship. The Europeans sought to get the Amerindians to help it to control Africans. Another conflictual relationship. And then as formal slavery came to an end and the plantation owners made their demands for reparations, part of reparations was indentureship. It brought here Portuguese and Chinese and East Indians. And in many ways, that form of labor, indenture labor, ran counter, to the free labor of the Africans. Conflictual relationships. The Chinese and Portuguese were given affirmative action in the business sector, the commercial sector. Licenses were given to them. Licenses were not given to Africans. Conflictual relationships. Some of the early riots, race riots, were not between East Indians and Africans. They were between Africans and Portuguese, for example. And so our country has a history of group conflict. And although the groups over time have found ways and means to collaborate when it suits them, when it suited them, generally those collaborations did not wash away the conflict. Dr. Walter Rodney, in his book, History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 2000 to 1905, is a good example of cooperation among the groups, Indian and Africans, coming together as labor, as anti-colonials, fighting against the colonial system. There have been instances of those experiences. But at the end of the day, the groups remained suspicious of each other and saw themselves in competition with each other. And so by the time we got to the time of independence, the question was, who governs? Who governs? The Europeans are leaving, the colonialists are leaving. These transplanted groups are now here, and who will govern? Who will govern? Given the system that the Europeans were passing over to us, passing on to us, the system of majoritarian winner-take-all, it meant that which group governs, that group would be the group that will form the majority and will govern over everybody else. That is the system we faced as we went into independence. And so it did not decrease the conflict, it increased the conflict. because it was a system that says one group shall govern, one group shall have a monopoly on power. And so there was little incentive for cooperation. Groups cooperate when there are incentives. That is what Walter Rodney was able to show in his book, The History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 2005, to 1905. And we've seen throughout our history, our ethnic groups coming together whenever there's an incentive to do so. What E.U.C. Kwajana, in a little piece, one of my favorite pieces by Kwajana, is called Meeting and Parting. Our groups meet and part. They meet when it's convenient, when there are incentives to do so, and they part when their interest supersedes, their individual interest supersedes any form of cooperation. And so we entered independence with a political system that is geared towards the perpetuation of power in a single party. And in Guyana, a single party meant single race. The original PPP, which was multi-ethnic, and in some respects even multi-class and multi-ideological. But that was short-lived. Didn't last long. It didn't last long. They developed ideological differences, and those ideological differences were played out along ethnic lines. And you may ask, well, what kind of craziness is that? How can ideological conflict play out along ethnic lines? What people did was to find ways and means of subsuming their ideological differences along racial lines, because it is race that mattered. Ideology mattered on the international front because it was the Cold War. And whether you were capitalist or communist or socialist, whether you were pro-Soviet or pro-American, mattered on the international scene, but internally, those things did not determine who won an election and who governed. Indians, Guyanese, were for the most part socially conservative, coming from the religion that they come from, coming from the caste system. And they were for the most part peasants, working the land as small farmers. And so one would think that ideologically East Indians would not be so much into the socialism thing. They should have lent more towards being capitalist, private sector, because they're peasants. They're small business people. That is how they evolved. Yet we found that the Indian merchant, the Indian sugar worker, the Indian rice farmer, the Indian fisherman, all found a common place in the PPP. So despite their ideological differences, they found a common home in this party. And this party declared itself a communist party. Yet these people from various ideologies found a home there. The Indian community was divided along religious lines. Religious is a form of ethnicity. Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and so on. There's some Buddhists and so on there. But those ethnic differences play themselves out in India. And so you saw what happened. India split between India and Pakistan. And then Pakistan split between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Pakistan and Bangladesh are Islam, Muslims. India is where the Hindus are mostly. So, and to this day, the ethnic conflict is playing itself out there in Asia. But in Guyana, that difference between Muslim and Christians and Hindus is not a big deal. They've been able to close those differences. And in Guyana, our East Indian brothers and sisters are East Indians. They've developed an Indian nationalism, an Indian identity. That Indian identity, of course, is heavily influenced by Hinduism, because Hinduism is the major religion in the community. So even when you have Indians who are Christians or they're Muslims, they're still heavily influenced by Hinduism. So they've developed an Indian identity in a place like Guyana. Same thing you say for Africans. Africans came in from different ethnic groups: Yoruba, Congolese, Igbos, Coromantes, Ashantis, Mandingos. We came here as different ethnic groups. We didn't come as Africans. We became Africans. Starting in the Middle Passage, we become Mati. Mati, which come from Métis on the slave ship. We become Mati. And so our ethnic differences have been transcended, and we become Black people, African people. All the religions that Black people have created, whether it's voodoo is really a coming together of all the West African religions. All the West African religions merging into voodoo, and then a little bit of Catholicism, the syncretism of all the different African religions, but they have to become African religions first. And whether it's Santeria in Cuba, the Baptists in the Caribbean islands, Trinidad, Grenada, etc., or the Comfort people in Guyana, is really a syncretization of all the various African religions into one. So we have become Indians and Africans in a way that in Africa we are tribes, or in India we are castes. And so the reality is that group identity in Guyana is heavily influenced by ethnicity, and over time the ethnicity has become race. Because we have found ways to make a distinction between the skin color of the African ethnics and the skin color of the Indian ethnics. And Amerindians also come from various tribes: Wapishianas and Arawaks and Caribs and Makushis and Waiwais. There are about 18 different tribes. But they've become Amerindians over time. Over time, they've become Amerindians. So our identities are shaped for the large part by race. I was looking at one of the international organizations the other night, trying to get some data. And I noticed they said the percentage of white people in Guyana is 1.2%. And Chinese, I think, was 2%. I was looking for Portuguese, and there was no Portuguese there. And then it suddenly dawned on me that Portuguese are lumped into as white people. Because remember, in Europe, the Portuguese are Europeans. They are what we call lower class Europeans. They're of the lower race. the lower right white race because of the mixture and so on with African tribes, the Moors and all of that history. The Spaniards and the Italians and the Portuguese are not considered high class white people. But in a place like Guyana, they become white. They become white. Chinese, you know, the same thing. You have Cantonese, Hong Kong Chinese, and all that, different Chinese and so on. But in Guyana, they're Chinese. So our identities in Guyana are determined by race. And I think one of the mistakes at independence was that our leaders thought they could get rid of race. And I understand, I can understand why. I can understand why. In Brazil, they first tried to get rid of race by whitening. Whitening. If you marry someone of a fairer race. And all that happened is that they created a large black community in Brazil. Brazil is a black country. Almost 110 million out of 180 million people are black or part black. And there are over 200 shades of black because of the whitening. Because they felt that was the way of getting rid of blackness. And if you get rid of blackness, you're getting rid of race. And then later on, they came up with the racial democracy thing, in which they said that there's no race in Brazil, you're a Brazilian. And for decades, Brazil officially did not have race. They said the problems that they had were not racial problems. They were at best class problems. The Brazilians imported tens of thousands of Europeans into Brazil in order to whiten the country. And yet, in the 1990s, Brazil had to admit that it was a racialized society, and they introduced affirmative action in the universities and so forth. So at independence, our leaders felt they could get rid of race. Just as in Brazil, they felt they could get rid of race. In America, they felt they could get rid of race too, by segregating the groups. And then after emancipation, they came up with the American colonization plan, which is to move Africans out of America into colonies. They created one in Africa, Liberia. They tried to create one in Haiti. It didn't work. But it was a semi-official policy of America to get rid of black people because they felt that black people would interfere with the purity of the white race. And so the way they wanted to solve the racial problem in America was by racial segregation, whereas in Brazil, they were doing racial integration. But all were aimed to get rid of blackness and ultimately to get rid of race. And so at the time of independence, I think our leaders genuinely believed they could get rid of race. You see, there was a debate, a discussion in the early PPP executive about what to do with the 1953 election. Some of the leaders felt that, the races were sufficiently united and that they could win an election and go to independence and all would be well in Guyana. And some of the other leaders like Martin Carter and Sidney King and so on felt that the races were not particularly yet united and that the PPP should not try to win the 1953 election, that they should try to win enough seats to get into the National Assembly, and that the party should spend time on the ground trying to unite the races. That proposal was overruled by a majority, and they went on to win the election. And they didn't last for more than 133 days. Even before they took office, the question of race surfaced. Because the Africans in the party wanted Burnham. The Indians wanted Jagan. Sidney King was proposed as a compromise candidate, and he said no. Bostonians still abuse him under their breath for saying no, because he could have become the first premier of Guyana, and he said yes. Because as he accounted, as he said, he was proposed by, I think, Carter and Westmus. And Burnham said, I'll support him. Jagan remained quiet. And Quayana read that to mean that Jagan was not in favor of him. And he did not accept, because he didn't want to be seen to taking away power from an Indian man. And the rest is history. Our history could have been different, that Quayana said yes, when he was Sidney King then. The country might have gone in another direction. But eventually they compromised. They compromised, and they were able to go into parliament, but they didn't last more than 133 days. Part of it was ideological, because the Americans thought they were building a communist country and invaded Guyana. But underlying it was race. The differences they were having. The urban blacks supported Burnham. The Indians generally supported Jagan. The rural blacks supported Sidney King. And in the end, it came down to race. Yes, when the split happened in 1955, J.P. Lachman Singh and Jai Narain Singh, two prominent Indians in the party, went with Burnham. And Martin Carter, Sidney King, Brindley Ben, prominent Africans, stayed with Jagan. But that didn't last long, because in 1956, Sidney King and Martin Carter and Rory Westmus left Jagan. And they parted with Jagan on the issue of race. Because no sooner had Burnham left, and at that time he had the Burnhamite PPP, no sooner had he left, the Indian business people like C.R. Jacobs and Bihari, these were big Indian business people, came into the PPP. They were Indian capitalists coming into a communist party. What did they have with a communist? What did the Indian capitalists have with an Indian communist party race? C.R. Jacobs and Bihari became ministers in the 57 to 64 PPP government. Sidney King and others left in the second split. Sidney King famously said, Dr. Jagan has lost confidence in the African executives of the party. Carter and Westmus and Sidney King, they wanted Guyana to go into the West Indies Federation of 1958. The West Indies Federation had brought together the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean countries into the West Indies Federation. Jagan did not take the PPP. He argued that Indians would become a minority in a West Indian nation. In Guyana, they were a majority. So that was another reason for the split between Sidney King, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, Lionel Jeffrey, Keith Carter, what Jagan called the ultra-left. They split in 1956. Carter and Westmus left politics, but Quayana went on to join the PNC, became its first general secretary and vice chairman. consolidating the PNC. Because as soon as the PNC was formed and Quayana and so on went into the PNC, Jainarine Singh and J.P. Lachman Singh, they eased themselves out. And so you had Indians, business people going into the PPP. Right-wing Indians such as Balram Singh Rai, who were critical of the PPP in 1953, they're now in the PPP. They're now becoming ministers. And Jagan is calling them patriotic Indians, patriotic Guyanese. So he's making space for Indian capitalists. He's calling them patriotic. And the same thing is happening on the African side. In the 1957 election on the East Coast, Sidney King runs as an independent. He didn't run as Burnhamite PPP or Jaganite PPP. And Jagan went up to Buxton and tried to get him, offer him the chairmanship of the PPP. And tried to get him to run as a PPP candidate, and he didn't. He said he'd run as an independent. And Jagan told him, "We'll fight you, comrade." And Jagan put Balram Singh Rai to fight him. The PPP did not field the candidate against Sidney King. The PNC, sorry, did not field the candidate against Sidney. It was the PPP. And Quayana Sidney King eventually lost that election by a couple of votes, I think 30-something or 40-something votes. But interestingly, on the night when the votes were coming in, the numbers were coming in, and I think Quayana was in the lead, and there were still votes to come in from Indian areas, and they asked Balram Singh Rai what he thinks of the race, and he said, race not done yet. Yeah. And that was an interesting election. Balram Singh Rai was known as an Indianist. He was very much into Indian identity politics. He was the man who was responsible for all those L-shaped schools, as we used to call them, in Indian communities as Minister of Education. Eventually fell out with Jagan because Jagan wanted Brindley Ben to be the deputy leader of the party, the PPP. He wanted an African face. But Balram Singh Rai beat Brindley Ben in a democratic election in the PPP for chairman and deputy leader. Jagan was not in the country, and when Jagan came back, he overturned the election and gave the victory to Brindley Ben. Balram Singh Rai was to leave the PPP. I'm making the point that if you look at our history, race has always been the defining factor. And so when we came into independence with a winner-take-all majoritarian system, the question was who governs? And who governs mean which race governs? They didn't negotiate a different system. Sidney King came out with a proposal for joint premiership, that Jagan and Burnham become co-premiers. Burnham said no, Jagan said no. When Jagan noticed that the Americans and the British were taking the power away from him, he then made a power-sharing proposal to Burnham. Gave Burnham deputy premiership, gave him the finance ministry, gave him home affairs ministry, and so on and so forth. And Burnham said no. Burnham said no. And of course, the British and Americans intervened. Regime change in 1964. PNC comes to power with UF. And in those circumstances, once you come to power in those circumstances, you are not as accountable as if you come to power in other circumstances. It's during the Cold War, the British and the Americans have to decide, are you going with the PNC or the PPP? The PPP declared itself communist. They're out. it means that Burnham is ruling the roost. Every time you want to move against him, he said, look over there. The PNC under Burnham tried to, I don't think Burnham was foolish enough. He was not foolish, sorry. I don't think Burnham was foolish to believe he could get rid of race. Burnham did make compromises to deal with the race issue. All those Indian holidays came under Burnham. He fiddled with the election. The PNC fiddled with elections. But although they fiddled with the election, they tried to reach out to Indians. They wanted to, squeeze the Indian community in terms of the rice industry. They centralized rice so that farmers had to sell their rice to the government agency, and then the government sell the rice overseas. And that was some form of control. But generally, Burnham couldn't break the Indian business monopoly. In the end, he had to work with them. In the end, he had to work with them. For a long time, Gawu wasn't recognized as the union in the sugar industry. Eventually, Burnham gave in to that. I am sure that in the earlys, he may have contemplated weakening the Indian influence in business. But in the end, it was you really couldn't do that. Especially when you were a quote-unquote minority government. And so there was a compromise. The Indians would, run the business sector and so on. And Africans would hold on to political power and military, the numerical majority in the military. It was a kind of arrangement, Just like in Barbados, the small white population, the understanding was that they would control business, and the black Barbadian elite will control the politics and education. And Errol Barrow used that to build up a black bourgeoisie in Barbados. And that is why Barbados thrived probably more than the rest of us in the Caribbean. Because they had that arrangement. In Trinidad, there was a similar arrangement. The French Creole, the Lebanese and the Syrians and the mixed red people, they controlled the business sector. Indians were in sugar, blacks were in oil. And so there was that unwritten arrangement. Same thing in Guyana. I don't think Burnham thought he could get rid of race, but he thought he could manage it. And he tried his best to manage it. But you can't manage a volatile racial situation as a one party representing one race. No matter how talented you are, you're not going to be able to do it. And Burnham had a lot of political smarts. He gave Indians a lot more than perhaps Eric Williams did in Trinidad. In Trinidad, Eric Williams called Indians a recalcitrant minority. Eric Williams. And in many regards, Burnham would have ceded more to Indians than Eric did in Trinidad. But you just couldn't break the racial thing. Jagan recognized that. In 1977, he came up with the National Patriotic Front, which advocated a joint government between the PPP and the PNC. In 1985, talks actually began on the Motherland Front between the PNC and the PPP. Burnham died, and Hoyt scuttled it. It would be interesting if Burnham had not died to see how far it would have gone. It had gone a long way. There are people who are still alive who were part of those talks, Halim Majid and some of the PNC people. I don't know if Hamilton Green was part of those talks. But when Hoyt came in, Hoyt scuttled the talks. But Burnham recognized that, look, the system couldn't work where one race and one party run things. Jagan said that he favored the Mandela formula. And if he got power, he would implement the Mandela formula, which was a national government of all the races. When Mandela got power, came to power in 1994, seats were set aside for the apartheid party led by F.W.D. Clark. De Klerk was a vice president. And I think 30% of the seats in parliament were set aside for de Klerk's party. Although Mandela's party, the ANC, won 90-something% of the vote, they still brought in the former apartheid leaders. There was also a breakaway, well, not a breakaway, another black party, the Inkatha party. And Mandela brought them in and made the Inkatha leader, I think it's Buthelezi was his name, made him the Home Affairs Minister. So Jagan wanted that Mandela formula, but when he got into power, no dice. He reneged on it. Hoyt later came around and said a national government is what we need. He came to that conclusion in August of 2002 at the PNC Biannual Congress, and he died in December. So he never got to implement it. But Robert Corbyn, who took over, sought to implement it and thought he had reached an agreement with Jacques Dion on a national government. But Jacques Dion claimed that it is Mrs. Jagan who scuttled the plan. Other people in the PPP said, no, it was Jacques Dion who scuttled it. At the end of the day, Corbyn was left hanging. That is when Corbyn moved to his plan B, which is what we know now as the APNU. He went to the WPA and they formed the Partnership for National Unity. The point we are making here is race is a real factor in Guyana's politics. And we have always tried to ignore it. And it has gotten worse because we've tried to ignore it. The PPP only recognize racial problems when they're in the opposition. When they're in government, they say race is not a problem. The minute they get into opposition, Indian people are oppressed. Indian people are this, Indian people are that. But when they come to power, they say race is not a problem. So they oppress black people, not because of their race, but in their head, they oppress black people because black people are inferior. See, this is the other factor. It's worldview. They're part of the Indian cultural and political elite and economic elite who actually believe that blackness is inferior to Indianness. Remember, they come out of the caste system ideology. You know, the Brahmins and the Kshatri, and those at the bottom are the Dalits or the untouchable, and they are the dark-skinned Indians, black like me, and so on. And that view of the world, that worldview, that caste system worldview, is still there in sections of the elite. I don't know how prevalent it is among rank and file Indians. I doubt it's that prevalent. But certainly among the elites, the caste system is very much there. And so black people are seen within the framework of caste as lower caste. This then influences policy. Because if you believe that blackness is equal to brownness or Indianness, then there are policies that will flow from that. If you believe that the world is divided along caste, then your policies will flow from that. You see, I'm arguing here that the differentiation in the distribution of resources, so much for sugar workers, so much for rice farmers, so much for fisher people, so much for public servants. Those are codes for race. And that distribution of wealth, I'm arguing, arises from a notion of differentiation in terms of value. I don't think anybody wakes up and says public servants will get 6.3%, 6.5% raise, and sugar workers will get 250,000. And we're doing that because they're black and they're Indians. I don't think it's as crude as that. But there's what is called the inherent unequal value system that operates not always consciously. I'm saying that there is an unconscious anti-blackness that exists even within the black community, because there are black elites who actually believe that black people don't have the same kind of equal values as Indians. You know, they say, why you all never do like the Indians? I grew up hearing that in the black community. It's a feeling that the Indian way of life is superior and that blacks must emulate it. So there's an anti-blackness even within the black community. It exists among the black elites. Some of them. Some of the black elites really think that black people are, no matter how you try with them, they're not going to do business. And if they do the business, they're going to spend the money out. You know, they're going to spend it on women. They're going to drink up liquor. They won't save. There is that view among the black elite. Some sections, not all, sections of the black elite of black people. And it's there definitely among a section of the Indian thinking. They actually believe that black people are poor, not because of the structural poverty in the system. They actually believe that black people are poor because they're cultural choices that black people make. I laugh now when I see Indian boys and girls wanging down to the ground and carrying on and drinking up the rum and playing the music loud. I always laugh now, because those things were supposed to be black excesses. And now you see Indian kids are doing it. It revolts the hell out of the Indian culturalists who believe that black people are inferior. Now their own children are doing these inferior things. How do you explain that? How do you explain it? Suddenly Indians have become inferior? No. So the whole notion of black inferiority is now laid bare because Indians are doing some of the badness that people thought were, natural to black people. No, badness is not natural to any group, any one race. You got bad Indians, bad behave, bad fashion Indians, as you have bad fashion Africans, bad fashion white people, bad fashion Amerindians. Now that Indian kids are behaving bad fashion, they're saying, they're misled. It's they're hustling to carry them back to the mosque and the mandir to save them. Because those badness supposed to be a black essentialist thing. And so the problem of race remains a problem that we have to confront. The problem in Guyana is that we do not confront race. We skirt around it. I laugh sometimes when people like my friend Ravi, they've accused me of having race on my mind. Then nobody got race on the mind more than Ravi. But Ravi's race is now in power. They have political power, they have economic power. And Ravi does not want contestation, because contestation will eventually lead to a reduction of Indian political power and maybe economic power. Ravi Dev doesn't want that. So he doesn't want the racial contestation. He's talking about crossover. This was a man who came and gave Indian ideology to Indian people. Now, the PPP always did it, but they did it under the bottom house. Ravi Dev brought it out into the open. And I have no problem with Indians engaging in identity politics, as much as I don't have any problem in African people engaging in identity politics. It's a reality. Identity politics is a reality in Guyana. It is how we manage it. How we manage it. Last week, I began to talk about what we call multiracial parties. There was a time when you could have multiracial parties in Guyana. I remember when the Working People's Alliance came into being in the 1970s. It started with an African base that Asquith brought in. And then IPRA, led by Moses Bagwan, brought in some Indians. And they were able to build a multiracial party, meaning that you had both ethnic groups belonging to the same organization and struggling against a common enemy and for a common set of values. There was a multiracial space in Guyana at that time. And so you could have a multiracial party. But once we get to 1992, and the choice in 1992 was who governs, again, as in the 60s, the 50s and the 60s, the question in 1992 after, the Cold War had ended and the need for fairer elections, the question was who will govern? And Indians said Indians must govern, and the Indians left the WPA and went back to the PPP. And Africans left the WPA and went back to the PNC, because the question was who governs? And as a young black woman told me at Kitty Market Square, I think in 1997, she said, I come to hear you all, because I think you all are very good people, you all are bright, you all got good speakers, good ideas. She said, so I said, well, you're going to vote for me tomorrow? She smiled. She must have been in her early 20s at that time. And she said, Mr. Hines, tell me something. They get any race named Multi? At that time, I realized that the space for multiracial politics had almost disappeared. And so the question today is not about a multiracial party. The question is about a multiracial movement. That parties that are grounded in the Indian community and parties that are grounded in the African community, and increasingly parties that are grounded in the Amerindian communities, come together and to form a multiracial movement, a multiracial a front. Because no single party can claim multiracialism. No, not one. The PNC is less grounded in the Indian community today than it ever was. There was times when the PNC could get some Indian votes. The PPP is seeing, it is spending multi-million dollars trying to buy black votes, and it's not getting them. It's very difficult for parties to be multiracial parties, meaning Parties in which you get people from all the ethnic groups in your party fighting for the same thing. They may be fighting for the same thing, but they're fighting in their ethnic parties. I hear people on our side, meaning the opposition side, they always say, Indians are suffering and so on. Indians are suffering, but they're suffering inside the PPP. They're not coming into the PNC or the AFC or the WPA to fight. They recognize their suffering. They recognize the PPP is oppressing them, but they're doing so within the PPP. And so the space for a multiracial party is no longer there. Does that mean that we should not have multiracial policies? Yes, that's where the struggle now has to go. Along with the multiracial movement, we have to have parties that advance, that are brave enough to advance multiracial policies. I am a party that is grounded in the Black community, but I am governing with policies that are beneficial to Indians and Amerindians and Black people. I am an Indian-based party, but I am advancing policies that are advantageous to Indians, policies that are advantageous to Africans, policies that are advantageous to Amerindians, and policies that are advantageous to all. If you are looking after the sugar industry, you're really looking after Indians. It has national consequences. If you're looking after public servants, you're really looking after Africans. It has national consequences. But policies to the public servants are really ethnic policies because they impact the African ethnic community more than any other community. And it's our inability to recognize how our policies can have negative ethnic consequences that have us in a lot of the nonsense that we're in. Look at this budget. And if you're Black, you're asking, where is the allocation for me? I am public servant. There's $7 billion there ostensibly for public servants' wages. 7 billion out of 1 point, almost trillion. You're looking at 200 and something billion dollars for roads. Those monies are going to be distributed via contractors. If you're African and Amerindian, where are the Amerindian and African contractors? Not many. So most of the $200 million gone to East Indians and perhaps Portuguese. You look at agriculture, 90-something billion for agriculture. Look where the money is allocated to. And you'll see that it's Indians are most in that sector. So most of that $97 billion gone to Indians or gone to the Indian community. And when you go through the budget, you will see. You will see that ethnically, the money is unevenly distributed. And so therefore, when we struggle for policies, we have to struggle for policies that will impact the individual ethnic groups and policies that are multi-ethnic in nature. Our party, the Working People's Alliance, has put forward the cash transfer, which will be given to each household, regardless of race. Each household will get the same amount of money under our plan. There'll be no $250 for Indian and $40 for Black people. If the money come up to 400,000, $500,000, $1 million, each household will get it. That is what you call a multiracial policy. And it doesn't have to come from a multiracial party. It must come from a party that has a multiracial vision. And you can have both a racial vision and a multiracial vision because there are problems that are germane to Amerindians that you have to treat as Amerindian problem. That thing that happened in Mahdia, that is an Amerindian problem. That fire is less likely to happen in an East Indian or African community. You look at the education outcomes in Amerindian communities, they're nowhere near what you're seeing in African communities and Indian communities. There are problems that are germane to the ethnic groups, and you have to deal with them as that. And then you have policies that take in all the ethnic groups. So you're walking on two legs at the same time. You don't deny race. We are not a colorblind society. If we are a colorblind society, it means that we are blind. And so we must not strive for color blindness. What we must strive for is color equality, color equity, color equitability, not color blindness. We do not want our people to be blind to our racial problems. We want to democratize our racial situation. So that Indians must not look across and see Africans getting more than them, and Africans must not look across and see East Indians getting more than them, and Amerindians must not look across and see. The races must be able to look across and see that they're all benefiting. There's never going to be an ideal, equal, but we have to strive for that. And who better to argue for Indian rights than an Indian organization? Who better to argue for African unity than African leaders and African organizations? Sisters and brothers, it is very important that we reorient our politics. Always reorient our politics. Even though we hold on to what we know, we must also find new ways of dealing with old problems. It was good to see the rally on Saturday. If for nothing else, just putting a couple of hundred people on the road is good politics. I've been very patient with the official opposition, which I think has not done enough mass retail politics. You know, there's the old excuse, we can't do rallies, we can't do marches, the PPP will infiltrate. That's true. That's true. But that should not mean that we must not have public events. We just have to do it differently. So it was good to see the opposition holding a rally. And it was good to see the AFC there, the PNC there, the WPA there. It was good to see, refreshing. And I hope they continue to do those events. We are doing our part here on social media every evening, every day. But at the end of the day, politics is fought on the ground. And the PPP, when they look and they see 1,000, 2,000 people coming to Politics 101 and the Ring and Straight Up in Mark Bishop, etc., and then they see 5,000 people on the ground, you're hitting them in two places at the same time. And that is why that rally was very important. I thought the presentations were strong. Norton's presentation was very good. Cameron Ramseytown was, as usual, good. Kidaki Amsterdam, of course, I am biased. He's from my party, but I think he represented our outlook very effectively. And it's good to see the coming together of all these forces, because each of them brings something to our understanding of where we are. Ideally, we would have liked to see a national rally in which the PPP is involved. That is not going to happen in the short run. So in the short run, we have to go for a unity that is maybe halfway to lay the basis for a full unity. If Padaji is not going to get that $100 million in the budget, there's the $100 million in the budget for the International Decade of the People of African Descent. Last year, the PPP give it away to whosoever will they may come, their friends, in order to spite it Padaji. And that is why I'm saying, if you are a party of one race, you're never going to govern fully in the interests of other races. And we have to find a solution to have a government that is representative of all races. Race will go away. Racial competition will go away when there is little to compete over. Meaning that when you distribute the wealth as democratically as you could, then there is less space for us to fight one another. And it's okay for us to say our fight is against the PPP government, not against Indian people, and that is true. That is true. But Indian supporters of the PPP are recognizing any disagreement with the PPP as being anti-Indian. That is a reality. You ask the average Indian, David, I don't know, he's a black racist, he don't like Indian people. Because my opposition to the PPP is seen as anti-Indian. And I can't spend my days trying to prove to Indian people that I am not a racist. I will do nothing else. And so I'm not going to make up stories in order to prove that I'm not a racist. I'm not going to water down my abhorrence of anti-black racism, anti-black government policies in order not to offend Indians. I know I will offend some Indians. I know I am offending some Indians. Back in the time when I stood with Indians in their struggle against Burnham and the PNC, I offended a lot of black people. It comes with the territory. I offended a lot of black people. Those of us black people who struggled against the PNC and in many regards helped to bring the PNC out of office. I'm not talking about the coalition, the previous PNC. We offended black people. And today when we are fighting against an Indian oligarchy, we are going to offend some Indian people. It comes to the time, I would rather it not be so. I don't set out to offend anybody. I set out to struggle for justice. And in the process, some people will feel offended. I cannot spend my time trying to prove I am not racist. If a man says, look, David Hines is a racist, he ceases any discussion with me. You don't have discussions with racists. And so in order not to engage what we are saying and what we are struggling for, you say we are racist. The people who don't believe that I'm racist are primarily African Guyanese. Some African Guyanese do believe people like me are racist. God bless them. But it is the African Guyanese community that is much more open to the advocacy against racism in Guyana. Because they're on the outside. Perhaps if they were on the inside, they would have a different view. That is the reality. And so we cannot continue to deny race. Race is not everything. Social classes involved, country versus tongue, woman versus man, women and children are as oppressed as ever. But at the end of the day, it is racial identity that drives our politics. I want to thank you all for giving me a hearing tonight, and I hope we've been able to put a few ideas on the table and give ourselves some things to work with. Because identity is important and ideas are important. Ideas, there's never any victorious, any successful struggle without ideas. You have to fight with ideas. Liberty and justice for all. All men are created equal. You have to fight with ideas. And we hope that we are fighting with ideas and we are trying to translate those ideas into action. I know a lot of people are frustrated. Guyanese are not rising up. Guyanese are, and I don't share that frustrated view. I think we could be doing much more as a people, as organizations of the people. We could be doing much more. But I am not startled. I think a lot is happening. And one day it will burst like a river bursting its dams. And we may not like how it will turn out. Tomorrow night I'm going to have my brother, Henry Jeffrey. And we're going to be talking about the issues of the day. The budget is here. And we're going to be talking about that. Henry Jeffrey, tomorrow night. Thank you all so much for staying with me. I love you all, and it is that mutual love that will see us through. The struggle goes on. The struggle goes on. It's a process. The struggle goes on.